So this is just going to be a very small preview window into some of the major topics about apologetics. And over the course of the 5 weeks, as Pastor Ramos already mentioned, we'll be unpacking more of those subtopics. So what is apologetics? It's certainly not the art of apologizing, although apologizing is an art, and you should probably look at that if you're not really good at apologizing to people. But it's rooted in the Greek, and it means, literally translated, a verbal defense. So Pastor Ramos already covered that. It's rooted in apologia in the Greek. Webster defines apologetics as a systematic, argumentative discourse in defense as of doctrine. It also has a secondary definition as a branch of theology devoted to the defense of the divine origin and authority of Christianity. So quite often it's important to learn the definitions of words and what they actually are. But as we're going to talk about a little bit later, it's sometimes more important to learn what they are not. And so speaking to that, in the next slide, what apologetics are not. They are not debating, arguing, proving, winning, judging, condescending, or uploading, okay? So while there are debates that happen between atheists and devout Christians, those are formal events that both get to prepare for, right? So what I'm talking about is as you approach people in your daily lives and you come to talk to them about your faith and you want to, impart some factual knowledge with them that relates to your faith, you don't want to get into a debate with them at that moment. It's not fair, number one, right? Because they haven't had time to prepare their side of the debate, right? And number two, then it just becomes more about the arguing, proving, winning component. So you don't really want to do that. So that's what apologetics are not. Uploading is basically sharing only your side, as characterized by some of the illustrations here. So people who just, put signs up, or they're just always pushing their ideas onto you without listening. So it's almost more important to listen than it is to speak sometimes. And that's similarly true when we talk about faith and God and religion. So, next slide. So why do Christians practice apologetics? This is really good because it's not something that we just decide to do. It's not just a passion. This is something that we are called to do biblically, right? So for personal, and for what reasons? For our own personal assurance. So Colossians 2:8 says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than Christ." What does that mean? It means see to it that you are armed with the knowledge to speak in rebuttal of anything that somebody is telling you that you know to be false in your biblical doctrine and your belief. So you will be assured as you continue in your study of apologetics. You'll be assured of your belief. Secondly, the biblical order. So there's a biblical order to actually practice apologetics. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." And I think that I'm going to read that again. But do this with gentleness and respect. And that's so key, because so often we can become a little bit abrasive in our beliefs, and we really want to impart our beliefs on other people. And we need to remember that we are called by God to do this with gentleness and respect. And just as it's set up in other places in the Bible, we do everything in love, right? So you want to make sure that you're not consumed with actually winning the argument or the debate more than treating the person you're discussing with gentleness and respect. Third, evangelism. So apologetics is a component of evangelism. And Romans 10:17 tells us, "Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ." And so in sharing the good news, right, as it's often referred to, this is a really important component of sharing the good news, is knowing the actual factual information that supports our belief. Last is modeled discipleship. So similar to 1 Peter, Acts 17:1-5 and 16:17 say, "Then Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. as was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. So this type of evangelism in apologetics is modeled for us through Paul's actions. Have you ever felt like you're reasoning and debating with somebody for days? He actually did it for 3 days. And sometimes I talk to some of my family members for an hour and I feel like it's 3 days. But nonetheless, I'm happy to do it, and it's God's word. Okay, common wonderings. So these are 3 major questions that kind of shape the I guess I'll call it the debate around apologetics. So where did we come from? Why are we here? And what happens when we die, right? So these are 3 questions that kind of have lived on in the ages, and people have wondered for all the time that people have been in existence, right? The answers, though, are found in the Bible directly. So creation is described in Genesis 1:1, as Pastor Ramos already spoke about, but also 27. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that's one verse we're really going to focus on today, because we're going to go back to like high school science, astronomy. Everybody excited about that? Yeah. Good. All right. Then it says in Genesis 1:27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, both male and female, he created them. And so that speaks to not only God's creation of the universe, but God's creation of us as human beings. Right? And we're going to talk about that as well. So that'll be high school biology 101. Okay, really exciting. All right, why am I here? The purpose of life. John 10:10 tells us the thief comes not but to steal and to kill and destroy. I come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. So why are we here? God says the purpose of our lives, the reason he created us was to actually enjoy our lives. And that's something that a lot of people miss and goes above their head. He intends for us to actually enjoy our lives. It's not intended that everyone become a priest or nun or, things of that nature. But he wants there to be diversity, and he wants us to enjoy and have passion about our lives and what we do with it. Last, what happens when I die? Salvation, everlasting life. The concept of salvation and everlasting life is described in John 3:16, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, but also in Psalm 146:4. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And his spirit departs, he returns to his earth, and in that very day his plans perish. So what happens when we die? We're not intended to, we're leaving our body, we're going back to the earth, and there are no more plans, right? We're no longer making any plans. Okay, so this is a really important question, and I welcome both the congregation and our guests to engage and to ask themselves this question. So if you could know that there is a God, would you believe in him? If you could know for sure that there was a God, would you believe in him? And why is this an important question? Well, Pascal was quoted, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive, right? So what does that mean? That means sometimes we believe things just because it's easier to believe that way versus another way. Sometimes we believe things because we might be scared of believing the alternative or the truth, right? And the only sheer barrier to truth is the presumption that you already have it, right? So if you already believe that I already know what I know, and you're coming at something with less than an open mind, and then you're not really going to hear anything, and you're not going to allow yourself any opportunities for consideration. And so if you're not ready, as Pastor Ramos spoke about earlier, you need to investigate that. Why aren't you ready? Why? Are you angry with God for something? Are you angry with your religion or an upbringing, a way that you were brought up that wasn't conducive for you? Whatever it is, that's something that you should investigate, and you should really look inward and I want to say ask God, but I want to say ask God, but that's another point. So that was another point I meant to mention on this slide, was that a lot of people will say there is no God and I hate him. Well, how can you hate someone who doesn't exist, right? If you believe that there is no God. So again, I'm just encouraging you to explore and investigate any biases that you might have toward the information that's going to be presented, not only today, but over the next 5 weeks and over the rest of your life. You know, if God will continue to put people in your life, he will continue to petition for the hearts of his children, who all of us are his children, right? So if it doesn't happen today, if it doesn't happen in 5 weeks, if it doesn't happen in 5 years, 5 decades, you know, you're still gonna be hearing from God in different ways. And so I would just caution you and encourage you to be open to that and to allow yourself to go through that process. Next. Okay, so here are the top 5 questions for apologists that people tend to ask, and these are 5 that are just central to like any atheistic Christianity-based debate. So how do you know God exists, right? How do you know the Bible is true? Where do science and the Bible disagree? And how can you believe in a God that allows so much suffering in the world, right? Last, how can you be sure that the resurrection happened? So this is so exciting for me because we're actually answering these questions in sequence, and we're going to lead up to that number 5 because the culmination of this series is going to be on Easter Sunday, also known as Resurrection Sunday, right? And so it's sort of perfect, almost like we planned it that way. So hopefully over the course of these weeks, we'll be answering at least in part some of these questions for you, if not all of them. Okay, so 5 types and approaches to apologetics and their purposes. Here's where we really get into it. So there are these 5 approaches. Typically, there's a classical approach, which is inherently just to establish theism. So you're really just, in a classical approach, you're just talking to somebody about the existence of a God, right? Second is the cumulative approach. And I always think about this in the O.J. Simpson case style, right? So it's how much circumstantial evidence is enough to win you over, right? So in the O.J. case, they ruled not guilty, but I think the majority of our country thought he was guilty and saw that there was enough evidence there to convict him. And he was later convicted in civil court, but there was not enough evidence to convict him at the criminal level, right? So when you think about a cumulative approach to apologetics, you're thinking about, okay, so maybe this bit of information, okay, maybe that could be true, but does it establish all the rest? And then maybe this bit and this bit and this bit, and all of a sudden you have a pile of what people might call circumstantial evidence, and is that enough? Is that enough for you? Okay. Then we have the third, historical evidential. So this presents this is the presentation of non-religious corroborating evidence. And what is that? Well, there are tons of non-religious historical documents that speak to the validity of the Bible, of the existence of Jesus, of Noah's Ark and the flood, and all these other events in the Bible that can be proven or have evidence or are evidenced in other scientific ways, right? So there's historical evidential. Presuppositional. So this is a logic-based sort of approach, and it's important that if you're taking this approach with a person or group, that they at least acknowledge that the Bible could be valid. Because if they don't acknowledge the Bible as valid at all, then any of the evidence you're going to present to them that's biblical is going to be null and void, right? They're not going to accept that as evidence. Experiential. So now, this might be the approach that most of us are familiar with. So this is more along the lines of like evangelical testimony. right? So it's giving your own personal accounts, relaying your own personal accounts of your experience with God to other people and how God has helped you, and using that as evidence to support the existence of God and your faith. So, yeah, that's it for that one. All right, classical approaches, apologetics. So establishing theism. So this is where we're really going to dig in for today, and we're going to get into three main arguments within the classical approach. So the three arguments are the beginning, which is the cosmological argument. And so this is talking about the fact that if the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner, right? The second argument is very close to the first, but not exactly. So the design argument is the teleological argument. And it says if the universe and us as human beings are intelligently designed, right, there must have been a designer, right? The third is the morality argument, and that one is the only one that's not scientific, but it's philosophical. And it raises questions about what is good and bad, and how do we know what is good and how do we know what is bad, right? So we're going to talk about all three of these today. The first two in great detail, the second less. But as we go through, I think you'll see why. Okay. So for the cosmological argument, right, this is if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. So this is really talking about the Big Bang, right? The Big Bang theory, which is a theory that, talks about how the universe just exploded into existence spontaneously. The evidence for the universe actually having a beginning is pretty well accepted by the scientific community, both Christian and non-Christian, non-believers. So I put these up here. There's an acronym SURGE, and it stands for Second Law of Thermodynamics, Universe is Expanding, Radiation Afterglow, Great Galaxy Seeds, and Einstein's Theory of General Relativity. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a scientist and can explain any of these at all to you. I probably would have failed this section of the SAT. But I know in my research that each and every one of these scientific principles is accepted by scientists all over the world, whether they're believers or non-believers. And so they have come to a general consensus that, in fact, the universe did have a beginning, for sure. So this is one of the arguments that really isn't really an argument anymore. So we kind of have a basis here for continuing on. And I welcome you to embark on research on any of them if you see fit. But I'm just going to put them up here for your citation purposes and move on. Okay. So Robert Jastrow, he's a physicist, and he won the Nobel Prize in physics. And he was also the founder of NASA's Institute of Space Studies. And he wrote, he's also an agnostic, so he's not a Christian. He's unsure. He wrote, astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis is the same. So what does that mean in layman's terms? It means that as a scientist, he could come up with no better explanation for the beginning of. He's saying, well, listen, if you're asking me as a scientist, I got nothing. I have no other explanation to give you other than, yeah, sure, this could be true, And he also said that there are supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientific fact. So he was saying there is hardly any other plausible explanation for the beginning of the universe other than a supernatural force, right? So we have that. All right. So now we have more non-Christian Nobel Prize winning physicists. So these are scientists in the top of their field, and they're non-Christian. They weren't raised in any belief system necessarily. They may have been, but they present and they say that they have no religious affiliation. So Arno Penzic said the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Right? So that's his best data. He's saying that I have no other, valid or plausible data to go on. Robert Wilson said, certainly, there was something that set it all off. There was something that set it all off. I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match Genesis. Okay, so again, he can't think of anything better either. He's like, well, when we really narrow it down to the first atom, I'm really not sure, but definitely this could be plausible. And George Smoot said, there is no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing. So again, there's definitely a parallel between the beginning of the universe and the biblical account in Genesis. Okay. I'm a teacher by trade, and teachers love if-then statements, right? So if one thing, then another thing, right? So if it's accepted already, and I think we've established that, right, with some of the world's top physicists, if it's accepted that the universe definitely had a beginning, then one of two things is true. Either no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing. I'll leave that to you. Food for thought. Maybe as you go to lunch and you leave service, maybe you can think about that. Talk about that with family and friends. It's a tough one. I think you'll get there. Okay. So now we have the culmination of the cosmological argument. So as we close in the cosmological area, we have the law of causality. Okay, so that law says that not everything needs to have a cause, but everything that comes to be must have a cause. So if something exists, it exists for a reason, right? By contrast, a widely accepted atheistic theory is the multi-universe theory, and that's the opposite. And it says that self-generating universes, multiple universes, grow like branches from a tree trunk in a model that allows the universe to create itself. Let me read that again. Self-generating universes, multiple universes, grow like branches from a tree trunk in a model that allows the universe, ready, to create itself. I'm not sure how logical that is of an argument, but again, I leave it to you as food for thought and as you go about your further research. Okay. Robert Jastrow again. He writes this as the culmination of a book that he wrote. He says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So what does that mean? After all of this studying and all of this research and all of this scientific prowess, he says he thinks it ends like a bad dream. Like, I've been doing all of this work for what? These people have been telling me this since the dawn of time, right? Which I thought was an interesting little tidbit. Okay, so now we're moving on to the teleological argument. Remember, this is the second of the classical approaches to apologetics. So the teleological argument, again, is close to the cosmological argument, but slightly different. Remember, the cosmological argument says that there was a beginning to the universe. The teleological says, what caused that beginning, right? It's asking, what caused that beginning? So if the universe and we are designed intelligently, then there must have been a designer. I really struggled not to put a picture of my own baby up here. She's just so gorgeous. Oh, now we woke her. All right. So the teleological argument is also spoken about in the Bible, and one of the places, of many places it's talked about, is Job 12:7-10. It says, but ask how the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Who knoweth not, In all these that the hand of the Lord hath brought this, in whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the brain of all mankind. Okay, so what is that saying? That's saying that the evidence for God can be found in all of the living creatures that he has created, right? And the complexities of their life. Now we have Psalm 139:13, 14. You have formed me in my inward parts. You have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. If you've ever carried a child or saw a woman through that process, you know that with every doctor's visit and every single sonogram, just how miraculous life is. That's all I can say. It's crazy, right? Okay. So that said, we've established that it's biblically based, right? The teleological argument. Now we'll move on. So again, another if-then statement. If we exist, then we had a design of the universe and of life itself. So Stephen Hawking, who's a world-renowned scholar, scientist, and atheist, he said that if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies. Now that's a whole mouthful, but what does it mean? It means if the universe had started to expand or grow any fraction of a bit bigger, faster than it actually did, we would cease to exist. The universe would have imploded, exploded, whatever you want to call it. It would cease to exist, right? And we would also have no other galaxies, right? Or we would have no other galaxies, which we know scientifically there are other galaxies, right? Okay, Arno Penzi also said that astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan, right? So, again, not non-Christian, Nobel-winning physicist saying it does seem like there would have to be something supernatural involved here. Now, scientists also like to talk about, in this teleological argument, the Goldilocks zone, right? And so we remember from that famous fable that she tried the porridge, and one was too hot, and one was too cold, and then there was one that was just right, right? Okay, so when we look at our position in the universe, our position on this planet Earth in the universe, we are the third rock from the sun, right? Love that show too, by the way, little plug. We're the third rock from the sun. However, if the Goldilocks zone says that if our planet in its orbit around the sun were to be just a little bit closer to the sun or a little bit further away from the sun, we would either burn or freeze, right? So we had to be placed very strategically in order to sustain basically water when you really look at the science of it. And water is the basis of life, right? Without water, there's no life. So this is also very interesting. So this also speaks to the unique conditions, the exactly right conditions required to permit life that Penzi was talking about. And so it's really impressive that he's able to acknowledge that there has to be some type of supernatural intelligent design at work. Okay. Now, as we continue on with the teleological argument, we have some facts about us. So we've talked about the universe and how strategic everything is in its design of the universe. Now we're going to talk a little bit about us as human beings, right? The science of us. So DNA. So DNA is the basis of all of our blueprint, right? As people, biological blueprint. So it's 3.5 billion with a B letters long. And each one of those 3.5 billion letters is in exactly the right order. There are no known chemical, physical, or biological forces that can explain this order. Okay? It's a code that's programmed very intentionally. Very intentionally. This is not the result of something, that just came into being or evolved into being this way. Amoebas. So these are the one-celled units. They're the simplest form of life at the cellular level, okay? So every cell in our body is made up of hundreds of amoebas, right? Thousands, actually, of amoebas. And each one of these amoebas, well, first let's back up. How big is an amoeba? How big is an amoeba? So if we had 1 inch, if we took a space of 1 inch, we could fit hundreds of amoebas in this space, hundreds, from line to line, right, on this 1 inch line. We could fit hundreds of them. Now, each of those 1 in 100, hundreds, holds the equivalent of 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia. Now, when I was in middle school, someone knocked at our door in New Jersey, and it was like a young college kid, and they had like 3 encyclopedias that they were carrying around, selling these encyclopedias. Does anybody remember that people used to come to your door and sell encyclopedias? Okay. Now, I really felt so badly because they were selling the whole set of encyclopedias, but they were carrying around at least 5 or 6 of them, and they were really heavy. And so I wondered how difficult it must be. It was hot. It was the summer. And I just thought, man, you really must need this cash because it's really hot. You're lugging around all these encyclopedias. Now, if we took 1,000 volumes of that encyclopedia, that's what would be in the single amoeba, of which there's hundreds of within an inch distance, right? Okay. Clearly, you're not as wowed by that as I am. But I find it fascinating. Okay. So, and Richard Dawkins also, who's the world-renowned scientist atheist, also concurs that there is that much information in a single amoeba, and he has very little explanation for how that could be. Okay, so let's look at embryonic fertilization. Okay, we're all here in this room. We are all a result of embryonic fertilization, right? So let's talk about the moment that your mom and dad made you, right? Okay, don't worry. This will be all good. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but I'll just stay on the scientific side of that. All right. So, and I'm not going to take any credit for this story because it's from Dr. Frank Turek. He's a renowned apologist and a well-studied PhD. And he's the author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Hey, there's a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And he explains it this way. He says that in the moment you each were conceived, your father sent the equivalent of the U.S. population, 300 million soldiers charging toward your mother. Okay? He sent 300 million soldiers charging toward your mother. And then after that, there was a race. Okay? And you won. So don't ever let anybody say you're not special because you won. Okay? Now, after that, the soldier and the egg held all the information that makes you you. So in that split second of conception, there has been no additional biological information added to you since then. So right now, you have the same amount of biological information as you did when you were your dad's soldier and your mom's egg, right? So that also is something that gets brought up a lot in the pro-life debate, but nonetheless, you can research it more on your own. But the fact that we have no additional biological information added to us now, however old you are now, from when you were actually conceived is phenomenal, I think. Then we have Aristotle's final causality. This says that the entire created order is goal-directed. Therefore, there must be an external intellect directing them, right? So if we're all existing based on Aristotle's final causality, there must be a final goal. There must be a final reason, a final goal that we're striving to. And who sets this goal? If there's a goal, there has to be a goal setter, right? Okay, so then we have this idea of final causality and the intended goal is really well illustrated in recent research that involves the mutation of fruit fly embryos, okay? Now, scientists have been trying to mutate fruit fly embryos to see what will happen, right? And so, if you're not familiar, the mutation of genes is intended to create something different, right? Take that genetic makeup and make something different, right? So to see what will happen, they've been doing this. And the embryos, what they're finding over years of time is that they're mutating these fruit fly embryos. And the fruit fly, this is a tongue twister, fruit fly embryos continue to try to get back on track and become fruit flies. Okay? What does that mean? That's huge. Guys, this is huge. Okay. I know. You're saying fruit flies are tiny. What are you talking about? It's not huge, it's tiny. Okay. So fruit flies. Why? There have been only 3 results in all of their studies. They have been either, they create either a regular fruit fly, so the fruit fly succeeds in getting back on track from its mutation, a mutated fruit fly, which is a fruit fly that is really not either. It's still a fruit fly, but it's mutated into, it's deformed maybe, you know? It's nothing successful, basically. If there's no successful mutation, it's anything else. Or, anybody guess what the third one is? A dead fruit fly. Good, Eddie, good. A dead fruit fly. All right. So they have not been successful in mutating these fruit flies. Why? And why is this huge? Well, it means that the genetic makeup of the fruit fly tells it that it has to become a fruit fly and nothing else. Nothing else. It's impossible. So with all, what does it say? It says that with all of our intelligence that we've amassed, especially in the last 20 years, right? With computers, science, everything, right? With all of our intelligence, we can't move a fruit fly from one species to another. We can't even get a horsefly out of a fruit fly. How is it possible that a non-intelligent process could do that? So that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. Okay. All right, let's move on from the fruit flies. We've graduated now. I'll be handing out certificates at the end of the session. Everybody will have a certificate of fruit fly mutation. Okay. We're graduating from fruit flies and we're going on to bigger and better things, the human eye. The human eye, okay? The human eye has millions, back up. When we talk about that moment of conception, right, of embryo fertilization that we were talking about just before, at that moment of conception, millions of microscopic nerves, optic nerves, begin growing from the eye through flesh toward the brain, right? So these microscopic nerves at the moment of conception begin growing through flesh toward the brain. At the same time, simultaneously, millions of nerves begin growing from the brain toward the eye. So they're growing toward each other. They have to meet somewhere, right? Each one, there are millions of these nerves. Each one must find its precise match in order for you to be able to see perfectly. If there is one out of any of these millions of nerves that does not find its match or that matches imperfectly, you will have imperfect vision. You will have some type of visual disability. The retina in your eye is the most light-sensitive object in the universe, more sophisticated in design than our most powerful electron microscope or satellite camera. Okay, so even NASA's satellites, the highest level microscopes that we have today, they do not compare to your eye. Now, Darwin, who is the founder of evolution, Charles Darwin is the founder of evolution, he said that to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Absurd. So here you have the founder of evolution, of the theory of evolution, saying to you, yeah, I really can't explain that whole I thing, you know? So that kind of rounds out our teleological argument. So remember, we're moving on now to the third argument, which is the moral argument. Remember in the beginning, I said that we had two scientific arguments and one that was philosophical. So here we have our philosophical argument. What is objectively or morally wrong? How do we know? And who decides? Right? How do you know? If I asked you, who was a better person, Mother Teresa or Hitler? How would you decide that? And if you told me Mother Teresa, I would say, well, how do you know? And you would say, well, she does all this good. You might say something, you might speak to all the good she does and her philanthropic work and, her selfless causes and all this. And I would say, well, that's fine, but how do you know that that's good? Who said that all those things are good? Right? And here's the other part. Many atheists will answer this question by saying, well, what's good is what the majority of people believe to be good, right? So let's go back to Hitler. In Hitler Germany, did the majority of people believe Hitler was good? Yes. They all followed him. They all had no problem. They believed he was trying to purify the race, right? They believed that he was doing good things, that he was doing good work. Now we look back at all the pictures of the Holocaust and we say, this is an awful thing that happened. An awful, awful thing that happened. Over 6 million Jews were killed, right? And that's a gentle way of putting it. So how do we know that that was bad? Well, without God, I'll back up. Without a standard by which we measure good and bad, then we don't know what good and bad is. Then whatever we say is good and bad is just an opinion. It's just an opinion. That could be your opinion. Well, I have my opinion. How do you know? You can't prove it to me. So we have to have a standard by which we measure good and evil, good, right and wrong, right? Let's look at something C.S. Lewis said. He talked about a straight line theory, right? So as this measure of good and evil, he says, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust, right? So this is sort of a very tiny preview into the concept of how and why God allows evil or suffering in the world, right? And Pastor Ramos is by far more prepared and armed to discuss that with you, and so I'll leave that to him. But it goes back to like those cliches that how would you know pleasure if you didn't know pain, right? How would you know joy if you didn't know sadness, right? How would you know sunshine? How would you know sunshine if you didn't know shadows, right? Sunshine inherently creates shadows. So it speaks to the connectedness of the opposites, right? Of both good and evil, right and wrong, nice and not, right? So in essence, evil itself does not disprove God. In fact, the opposite, right? If we didn't have evil, we wouldn't know good. Everything would just be good, and we wouldn't even know how good was, right? Okay. So in review, that felt faster than I thought. In review, so we've talked about, I've introduced you to the 5 approaches to apologetics. We went into greater detail with the classical approach today. And we know that now in the classical approach, there are 3 veins: the cosmological, teleological, and moral philosophical veins of the classical approach. The cumulative approach, you can use a lot of the information, obviously, that we've seen here today in the cumulative approach. And we're going to go deeper into historical evidential in week 4 when I present on that specifically. The presuppositional is only to be used after you've established a basis of the validity of the Bible, remember? And then we have experiential, which is something you're all experts in. That's the good news. You're all experts in experiential apologetics because it's all about your own personal walk with God and your own personal experience. So use that. You have a PhD in it. Go for it. Absolutely. Okay, and that's where it gets really, really exciting. So now you have all this information. You made it through. Most of you are awake, which is good. And what do you do with it? So what do you do with it? Well, I would encourage and ask you to continue your own research for sure. This is just like a sliver, like one of those amoebas. It's a tiny sliver within an inch of how much information is out there. And I encourage you to research, do your own investigations, your own investigating, and in that, speak to other Christians, and even non-Christians. Hey, you never know, how God is working. I mean, I know how he's working, but you may not know how he's working. And then reflect on what's been presented. So don't just take what's been said today, put it in your back pocket, and be like, all right, if you feel, God is going to continue to knock on the door of your heart, And I would just encourage you not to keep it shut, Be open to the possibility. Reflect on it. Really internalize it. Look at your own prejudices and biases against faith, right? Like we talked about. Consider that if this is all true, then what? Right? So we talked about that question at the very beginning. And then I would invite you lastly to join us next time because it's really going to be very exciting. Yeah. I'm excited about this. And we are arming ourselves with weapons. And the weapon is the Bible and information and knowledge and truth, right? So I encourage you to continue to come back and arm yourselves because you need to be ready at any and all times. Remember, this is a biblical order. Be ready to defend your truth, your faith. And I thank you.